We are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. I wanted to welcome everyone to the webinar this evening. My name is Dr. Lauren Levine. First and foremost, I hope that everyone is staying healthy and safe out there. I commend you all for being here this evening and continuing your dental education. We had a great turnout this evening. I've been doing this content for the last, 3-4 years, and typically, we average about 200 to 250 registrations. We had over 500 registered this evening, and I think maybe it's just word starting to get out there that ransomware has not avoided the dental industry. When I first started doing this, most people didn't know anybody that had been affected. That's not the case anymore. Most of the offices we work with have either been hit already or they have one of their colleagues that was hit. So we're going to cover a lot of bases this evening. The theme for the presentation is cybersecurity, ransomware, and HIPAA for dentists and dental labs. We're fortunate to have a number of dental labs joining us this evening as well. My goal is that hopefully you're going to learn at least one new thing that you didn't know beforehand. If you learn one thing that you didn't know, then that's great. I think that I've accomplished my goal. I think you're going to hopefully learn a lot more than that, but that's the goals. And I want to give you the steps to how to get your office in better shape when it comes to protecting and securing the most critical thing that you have, which is your data. As with all my webinars, this webinar is recorded. I'm going to send out a link to the recording probably sometime later this evening, perhaps tomorrow morning, in case you can't make it until the end. So don't worry about it if you can't stay late. One of the things that's really important to me is that you get your questions answered. We're going to have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. On your screen, if you haven't been on webinars in the past, you have a little control panel there. Go to webinar control panel. Type in your questions as you think about them. I'm the only one presenting tonight. I don't have anyone helping me, so I have to minimize the panel. Basically, I cannot see the questions until I'm done speaking. So just go ahead and put it in there. I'm in no rush. The presentation is going to take about an hour or so, and then I will open it up to Q&A, and I'm happy to stay as long as people have questions if they want to get answered. Also, if you stay on for the bulk of the webinar, I will be sending out California approved CE credits. I'm not really aware of any state that won't take California credits. I send that out when I send out the recording as well. That's for people who stay on for the bulk of the webinar. Obviously, I can't send out a CE credit if you log on and log off 5 minutes later. It doesn't work like that. But if you're here for the bulk of the webinar, then I will be sure to send out those credits for you as well. So a little idea about what we're going to be discussing this evening. I'm going to a short introduction about myself. I was, as many of you know, I was a practicing periodontist for 10 years. I did not love doing perio. I liked the implant part of it. I didn't love osseous surgery and connective tissue grafts. Along the way, my family owned an electronics business when I was growing up. So I became certified in computer repair and networking. And it's a long story, but real short version of it is I moved to California when they passed licensure by credential, planning to practice, didn't know that they had 15,000 people on the waiting list and it was going to be a year before I could get a license. What I'm doing now took off, and by the time I could get my license, I said, I didn't love perio the first time around, so not sure why I want to do it a second time as well. What I do is to work with offices all over North America. We actually have a few in Europe and Australia as well, to help them with their IT needs. We are full service IT. We do have a number of offices we work with that say, I've got a local IT guy, he's great, but he doesn't really know the HIPAA stuff, the cybersecurity stuff. How can we work together? And I said, great, that's not a problem at all. We continue to work with your IT person. We will fill in the gaps and of course work with them to make sure that we're all on the same page, and we'll provide all the services that you're currently not getting. So I've already done the introduction. I'm going to start off with an FAQ, frequently asked questions. What are the questions that I see on a regular basis? I have a really short quiz. Sometimes I've had this quiz as being 15, 20 questions. I narrowed it down to 8 questions tonight just to sort of get a feel for where you're at. You don't need to type in your answers. It's just be a matter for you to think for a second, how you would answer that. We'll get to the bulk of the presentation. I do want to make a few offers to people who are on the webinar this evening. And then as I said, we're going to open it up to a Q&A session at the end. What are these FAQs? What are the questions that I get on a regular basis? We're talking about cybersecurity, but some of us may not know exactly what that means. So I'll give you what I think is the best definition of cybersecurity. Specifically, when we're talking about cybersecurity, the real concern is ransomware. And again, we need to know what we're talking about. What is ransomware? Hopefully, most of you have heard about these viruses. They're a virus that locks your files, and we'll get into a little more detail exactly what that is. But it's important that we're all on the same page when we have a definition of that. One of the questions that I get from a lot of people is, does HIPAA play a part in any of this? And I'll give you a hint. The answer is yes. It's a big part. We'll talk about some of the HIPAA regulations and how those affect your decision-making process. How do you protect the data? This is really the bottom line for most practices we're working with. What are the steps that you really need to do to protect and secure that data? We'll talk, that's really the bulk of the presentation this evening. One of the things we'll be talking about is a firewall. Well, what's a firewall? Again, we need a definition of what a firewall specifically is. I'm going to be talking about a new concept that many of you may not have heard of. It beats everything out there when it comes to antivirus, anti-ransomware protection. Better than firewalls, better than anti-malware software. It's called application whitelisting, one that's kind of related to its ring fencing. I'll tell you why I truly believe this is better than sliced bread, and why it's something that you really should be incorporating into your practice. How do you keep your systems up to date? It's relatively easy to do that in Windows, although we don't typically recommend using Microsoft for the updates. A lot of time their patches are more trouble than they're worth. But how do you do that for all the other software that you have? Office and Adobe, all the various software systems that you're using. I could literally spend the entire presentation just talking about backup. I'm not. We'll spend a few minutes on it, but it is pretty important that you have a good backup protocol. For most practices, the issue isn't that you're backing up your data, because almost every method out there works. The question that I think many of you need to ask yourself is, if my server goes down for any reason, if there's a theft or fire, flood, or something along those lines, how long is it going to take me to get up and running again? And one of the best ways to test that is to turn your server off and see how long it takes. For many of you, that's going to be measured in days, and we don't want to measure it in days. We want to measure it in minutes, perhaps an hour or two, and we'll talk about the systems that allow you to do that. Do you have to encrypt your data, and if so, how do you do that? We'll talk about that. One of the HIPAA rules is that there are 2 types of regulations. There's mandatory required rules, and there's what's called addressable rules. We'll talk about what addressable actually means. That is what encryption is. It's an addressable. It is not the get out of jail free card that you may think it is. When it comes to actually applying this, it is a get out of jail free card when it comes to breaches, and we'll talk about that. Finally, do you need to do a risk assessment? Again, a hint, yes. And what is it? How do you do it? We'll talk about that. Basic concept with this is that you would not, ideally, hopefully not, you're not treating patients without diagnosing them first and having a treatment plan. Same thing with HIPAA. How do you know where you're falling short of HIPAA requirements if you don't look? So we'll talk about the need for that as well. So why do we talk about this? Why do I think it's such a critical topic in dentistry? Well, it's almost impossible to go to your favorite news website, whatever that happens to be, and not hear about the latest breach that's occurred. This is one that occurred this past summer from a company called Kaseya. Kaseya is what a lot of us in IT use. It's called RMM, Remote Management and Monitoring. Most of us in IT provide remote access services so that we can work on the computer as if we were right there. Well, If there's a problem with the software that we use to manage that, that's a big problem because it can really affect a lot more than just individual IT providers. It can affect all their clients as well. Kaseya is the largest one out there. We fortunately were not using Kaseya at the time that this happened, but that's an important thing to be aware of. Many of you, I'm sure, last summer, especially on the East Coast, knew about the Colonial Pipeline. They ended up spending millions of dollars to pay off the ransomware hackers. They were one of the very few examples I know of a company that actually got some of it back. Of course, they had the weight of the US government behind them. Most of us would not have that. But the thing that I highlighted, which I think is kind of critical to understand, is that it was the result of a single compromised password. All it took was one person. This all happened during the height of COVID, so certainly there's a good chance that people were working from home and they had remote access, and all it takes is that password to fall into the wrong hands, whether it's accidental or on purpose. We don't no idea how that password got compromised, but once it's there, all bets are off. So it didn't take much for that to happen. I was watching the Super Bowl, and there was something on the banner at the bottom about the San Francisco 49ers had been hacked with ransomware. Nobody's safe. It can happen to anyone. NVIDIA just got hacked a couple of days ago, and they're leaking company data. And NVIDIA is the largest company out there when it comes to graphics cards and graphics chips. So nobody's safe from that. If you think that, hey, well, I'm a dental office, who's going to possibly try to attack me? Think again. This was from a couple of years ago. There were 400 offices mostly in the Wisconsin area that were hit all at the same time. A few months later, there was 100 offices in Colorado that were all hit at the same time. And I kind of alluded to this earlier, is that you might be doing all that you can to protect yourself. But what about your IT company? As I said, all of us use this remote management and monitoring software. And for most of us, it's a portal. It's a secure portal that we log into. We personally have about 1,800 computers that we have access to at any one time. If someone were to get into our portal, one of the things that we can do with that software is to push files and copy files, both directions. So you think about it, they get in, they can get a ransomware virus and push it out to every one of those 1,800 computers all at the same time. That's exactly what happened with that case in Colorado and in Wisconsin, is that these IT companies were not doing best practices. They were not doing, one of the things that we always recommend is what's called two-factor authentication, 2FA, where it's not enough to just log into a website, a secure website. It would then send you a secondary code, usually on your cell phone, maybe on email, and you have to enter that code to get in there. They were not doing that in this particular case. They got into the portal, they pushed out the ransomware. And for those of you who say, think that, hey, we just, all we need is antivirus software to protect us. Every one of those people were using Windows 10. They all had the built-in Windows 10 Defender software, antivirus software, and it didn't do squat. So we'll talk about the fact that the days of just slapping antivirus software onto your system, unfortunately, are long gone. We're really recommending a layered approach, a stacked approach, multiple levels of protection. Ransomware is it counts for close to half of all the insurance claims. 2020 is the last year that we have full data for. Some other scary statistics, if I haven't already scared you. About a third, 34% of all healthcare organizations were hit by ransomware in the last year. 65, 2/3 said that the people that were doing that were successful in encrypting their data. The key number that I want you to look at is the one that I have the arrow next to there. 34%, so more than a third of those whose data was encrypted, they paid the ransom to get the data back. But just below that, which is I should have put an arrow to that as well. On average, only 69% of that data was restored. So think about that for a second. You decide to pay the ransom, which we obviously don't recommend if there's any way around that. You pay it, you get the encryption, the decryption key, you run it, and you still find that close to a third of your data wasn't able to be restored. God help you if it's the .dat file from your practice management software, the key index files. because then you're dead in the water. You have no way of recovering that data. So in my mind, we'll talk about this, the best way to deal with ransomware is to make sure it never gets onto your system in the first place. Some pearls of wisdom anytime I'm giving any type of lecture, and this is true for ransomware and cybersecurity and HIPAA as well. I'm going to go over some systems and recommendations that we've used for dental offices for 20 plus years, for labs as well. There's no perfect system out there. There's what's right or best for your office, but there's no, this is the right way to do it or this is the wrong way to do it. There's always, it depends on the size of your business, size of your practice, size of your lab. The needs of a solo practitioner are going to be different than a DSO. So, you have to find out what the right solution is. We'll be talking about all these systems that you need to have in place, but you don't want to get ahead of yourself. For example, we still work with offices that are running Windows XP and Windows 7 and Server 2008. And those systems haven't been updated or patched in quite some time. That's a significant security risk. So it really doesn't make a difference what you do when it comes to firewalls and antivirus software. If you're running outdated hardware, all bets are off. So, don't put the cart before the horse. And the final thing is, in real estate, they always say the three most important things are location, location, location. When it comes to this, planning, planning, planning. Nothing wrong with doing things in stages. As long as you've got basically a game plan or a treatment plan, which we'll talk about, of how to protect yourself. You can do things in stages. You just have to figure out where you want to be at the end of that process. So I'm going to give you a few questions here. Let's see, where you're at. As I said, don't bother typing in the answers. It'll make it hard for me to want to get to the Q&A afterwards, but I'll give you a second or two to think about each one. If your practice is audited, the first thing the auditors will want to see is your backup, a risk assessment, evidence of encryption, or your server. This one's a little bit easier. It's a risk assessment. Just like if you ever get sued, hopefully never, but if you ever get sued and get hauled into court, the first thing they're going to want to see are your records. They're going to want to see your diagnostic assessment of that patient. Same thing here, is that if they show up to do an audit and they see you've never done a risk assessment, you don't have any type of plan in place, it tends to go downhill really quickly from there. Other thing that's really important to understand is that you have to do it. There is a HIPAA law that says you have to do a risk assessment. It also means that you have to follow through. Just like if you do a treatment plan for a patient, that's not enough. You have to do the actual treatment. Same thing with this. If they show up and they see that you've done the risk assessment and you have a plan, but you never lifted a finger to do anything about it, that's what's called willful neglect. And those are when you start to see some of these really big multi-million-dollar fines and penalties and settlements. You don't want to be that person. You want to be the person that said, hey, yes, I did the risk assessment. And at the very least, we got started on addressing the things that we found. A couple of my little pet peeves, there's companies out there that say, hey, we used to do just OSHA, but now we're doing HIPAA. To me, that's like a dental office saying, hey, we're going to do dentistry and be a barbershop at the same time. It's just the skill sets are completely different. They have nothing to do with each other. HIPAA, especially when it comes to an assessment, is a highly technical thing. There's no way, in my opinion, that you can do a HIPAA risk assessment with anyone other than an IT company, especially one that's got a lot of fluency in healthcare. The other thing, which we'll talk about, is that there's not a whole lot of guidance when it comes to doing a risk assessment. There's literally one sentence. And there are companies out there that will tell you, hey, go online and take our online quiz and you do that and you're done. And I promise you, you're not. That will not cut it with any of those auditors. You really need to make sure that you've got adequate protection in place and that you've done everything you can to do a formal risk assessment. When we do it for our clients, about 5 to 8 hours. We don't need you for more than 10 minutes of that to get us onto the systems, but the actual process takes multiple hours to be done properly. Okay, HIPAA requires that you patch all the software on your computers on a regular basis. Is there actually a law that says you have to do that? That is true. It's called patch management. And it's something we'll talk about briefly, but it is a HIPAA law that you do need to keep your systems current and up to date. That's why, a few years ago, many of you probably remember your IT people coming to you in around January of 2020 and saying, hey, if you're on Windows 7 and if you're on Server 2008, you need to upgrade because they're no longer being supported or patched. The support wasn't the issue, it's the patching that was the issue. Which of the following should you do if you're hit with a ransomware virus? A, panic. Well, I'm sure a lot of you will, but hopefully not. B, ignore it. C, restore a recent backup. D, pay the ransom. With a proviso, yes, typically you're going to want to restore the recent backup after making sure you've removed the virus. That is critical, and oftentimes that takes a day or two just for us to make sure that we've got it off your system. Restoring the backup's not going to do you a whole lot of good if the virus is still there. It's also not going to do you a whole lot of good if you get hacked by one of these ransomware gangs that are doing what's called double and triple extortion. Double extortion is, hey, you don't want to pay us, fine. We're going to take your database and put it online. And if that isn't enough to convince you to pay up, then there is triple extortion, which is, hey, we got into your database. We can see all the patient records. We're going to start calling up your patients and let them know that you were hacked as well. So, it may not be enough to just have a backup. As I said, keeping the ransomware off in the first place is really the key issue here. You don't want to be on a website like this where, the database got put up there and it's there for everyone to view and download and do whatever they want. So typically, this is pretty bad when you get to this position. What do you have to do if you are breached, though? Do you have to notify the Health and Human Services and be listed on their website? Do you have to notify the local news media? Do you have to notify all your patients of record in writing, or is it all the above? And unfortunately, it's all the above. You have to do all those things by law. Which is the following is an example of a business associate? There's a lot of confusion out there about what an business associate is. Basically, it is someone who has access to your data that is not part of the continuum of care. So a referring practice would not be a business associate because they're part of that continuum of care. Same thing for a lab. They would not be a business associate. Cleaning crew hopefully is never getting onto your computers. But if you're allowing Dentrix or any practice management software company to get onto your system to do troubleshooting, and they can potentially be looking at your data, you have to have a signed business associate agreement with them. If you encrypt your data, you're exempt from the breach notification. I actually alluded to this a little bit earlier. That is true. This is your get out of jail free card. That if your server was stolen, for example, and you had evidence that your server was encrypted, you do not need to declare a breach. This is the one and only case where you can get out of having to declare that breach. So all the more reason why I think you really should be encrypting your data. Antivirus software is the best defense against ransomware. Yeah, maybe 5-6 years ago. Right now, we'll talk about this a little bit later. It's called application whitelisting. I think it really is the best thing out there for dealing with ransomware. If you're hit with a ransomware virus, you must report a breach. This is something that a lot of you may not be aware of. The answer is true. Back in 2016, there was a thing by Health and Human Services, and I'll blow this up for you. It basically says that you have to declare a breach unless there was a low probability of compromise. The problem with, and they don't tell you how many of these things have to be false for you, to get out of it. But, if you got compromised, your protected, electronic protected health information has all kinds of data in it. So, you would fail on that point. You don't know who the person was that logged into your system. You don't know whether they actually viewed or not. So, you've already 0 for 3 on the first 3. Yes, everyone at some point would be able to say that they mitigated the risk and got rid of the virus. But the basic rule of thumb is if you are hit with ransomware, you suffered a breach. Even though we don't think of breaches in those terms. Normally we think of a breach as, well, someone logged into your network or you lost a laptop. The way that Health and Human Services defines it is loss of control of your data, which is exactly what a ransomware does. So let's get into some definitions here. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but just want to make sure that we're talking about the same thing. Cybersecurity, it's technologies, processes, practices that protect your IT stuff, your networks, devices, programs, from it protects it from attack, damage, or access. Sometimes we call it IT security or information technology security. For a dental office and labs as well, this includes basically everything that we'll be talking about: firewalls, encryption, patching, some type of anti-ransomware software, general purpose antivirus software, application whitelisting, backup and disaster recovery, training your staff, and some type of risk assessment. These would all fall under the cybersecurity definition in the dental industry. What about ransomware? Well, as I said, most of you probably know what this is by now because you read about it so much. In the past, the way that it used to work was it would lock your screen. That's a really old, outdated system. Now what it does is it actually locks the files. We call them crypto ransomwares, but it's basically they lock your files. You get a note that says, hey, you've been compromised, and here's how to get your decryption key, and it involves money. So that's why they call it ransomware. You're paying a ransom to get your data back. This is the type of thing that you would see where you get a little Word document or a text file that pops up when you get in one morning. They typically want you to use a secure browser called a Tor browser. If you're paying them, it's going to be in cryptocurrency. They don't take Amex or Visa. They don't take cash or checks or anything like that. It's going to be pretty much untraceable cryptocurrency that you're going to have to pay with. So once you paid it, it's gone. What are some of the consequences of this? Well, it depends on this, like I said, the size of your business, size of your practice, your lab. But for many practices, labs, you're going to be down for the better part of a week to get rid of the ransomware, to recover from everything. And you're looking at tens of thousands of dollars. And this is just talking about downtime. And again, if you're a DSO or a large group practice, it's going to be much higher than this. If there's fines and penalties, then it's going to be significantly more than that as well. As I mentioned, breach notification, a lot of HIPAA is really ambiguous. A lot of it's open to interpretation. Breach notification is really one of those things where it's not. It's really cut and dried in stone that if you suffer a breach, you have to notify patients in writing, you have to notify the local news media, and be listed on the Health and Human Services website. We call it the wall of shame, and it's really not a place you want to be. So what's the approach? How do we deal with it? It's basically, I'm going to recommend a 6-step approach this evening. First and foremost, keep the bad guys out. That is the most critical. Prevent them from ever getting on in the first place. As much as we try our best to do that, the fact remains is that not every system out there is foolproof. So you're going to have to deal with that malware. Malware just basically means anything that's bad. So viruses, phishing, ransomware, worms, all that is malware. Deal with it if it gets in. Make sure you've got some encryption in place so that you may not have to declare a breach if that were to happen. If you're going to recover, it's going to be your backup and disaster recovery system. We'll talk about how I recommend that you set that up. You really should have some type of cyber liability or breach insurance. When we do a risk assessment for our clients, we do a minimum of $250,000 of coverage. Like I said, you can't prevent all breaches, so you really should be covered. And we'll talk about how to do a risk assessment. So one step at a time, how do we keep those bad guys out? The 2 easiest ways to do that are firewalls and patching. What's a firewall? I'm sure many of you have heard about these terms. They come in different forms. There are software firewalls out there. When I talk about a firewall, I'm talking about a physical hardware device. It monitors ingoing and outgoing traffic, and it decides whether it's going to allow it or not. We've been using firewalls for decades now. As I said, they come in all shapes and sizes. Every router out there has a built-in firewall. Your cable modem has a built-in firewall. They are, basic at best. We're always recommending that you do a dedicated hardware firewall. So, make sure you set up and configure a business class firewall. Business class means Sophos, SonicWall, ones like those. We don't recommend home routers like Linksys and Netgear and D-Link and ones like that. If you want to know if your firewall is working, you can hire somebody. This is when we do our risk assessments, this is part of what we do for our clients, is what's called penetration testing. Can we get through the firewall? You know, that's the only way to know for sure, is to have someone actually try to get through that firewall to see if it's working. So, you know, these are the ones that we use, the Sophos XG series. I think they're actually, we just found out they're dropping that line in a few weeks, so we'll be using a different model. But, you know, Sophos, SonicWalls, ones like that. You need to also make sure that you keep your systems current and up to date. It doesn't take long for people to find those security loopholes in the software and get in. So this is why most of any good IT provider in the dental field is going to offer what's called managed services, patch management. It's a fancy way of saying automation, where rather than us having to do that manually, there are software programs that we install that can go out and find the latest patches, apply them on the schedule that we recommend, not what they recommend. You know, Microsoft almost always does it on Tuesday nights or early Wednesday mornings. A lot of you come into your office on Wednesday mornings and can't figure out why your computer's rebooted. It's because of Microsoft. So you need to keep up to date and current with that as well. One of the other ways that we're seeing really tends to potentially create a lot of havoc for offices is how they set up the remote access. Because we said we need to keep the bad guys out. If you're creating an easy system for people to get in, which is what remote access does, that can really be a problem. So let's briefly talk about the different ways of being able to log into your system. We find that most offices still need to have some type of remote access. Obviously, at the beginning of COVID, when we were shut down for a few months, you didn't have a choice. But a lot of practices want to be able to access records on the weekend. They want to be able to, you know, call patients if it's a snow day. So you really still need remote access. And of course, as an IT provider, we always need it. Who else would have access to your data? Well, you obviously, if you're a lab owner, your staff, any remote workers you have, your IT team, your accountant, if they're logging in, if some of you use like a practice management consultant, the software vendors. As I mentioned earlier, for every person that you are allowing to access your system, other than your employees, obviously, but if it's a third-party company, you have to have a signed business associate agreement in place with them. So you have 3 different methods that you can use for remotely accessing data. You could have it all up in the cloud. You can do remote control, which is basically accessing a computer from another location. And you can use what's called a VPN, or virtual private network, where, and I'll explain what that is in a few minutes. The cloud applications, well, so I think it's important to understand what cloud computing is. We all talk about cloud and, you know, what does that actually mean? This is like a kind of a long definition about, you know, that it's, you know, you don't keep proprietary hard drives and you use it on a remote database. I'll give you a better definition. Cloud computing means somebody else's server. That's basically what it is. It's data that you're putting on someone else's server and pushing that data out to you. That's basically what it is. What are the reasons you would look at cloud computing? Well, it's secure. You have to assume that they're doing a good job. We haven't heard of any major dental software vendors that are cloud-based that have ever been compromised. So, you know, they are very secure. You have accessibility. To me, you know, if you have a multi-location practice, this is the ideal solution, is to have a cloud software set up. They're relatively easy to configure. You actually don't configure at all. You pull up your browser and log in. That's basically all you need to do. You don't have to worry about disaster recovery for that specific data. You know, I always caution people, and I always post about this on Dental Town, is that, you know, some of the reps for these cloud computing companies say, hey, you know, go with our software. You don't need a server. You don't need all this other stuff. And that is not true. Yes, a lot of your data is in the practice management software, but certainly not all of it. What about your images or Word documents or spreadsheets or emails or QuickBooks or Invisalign or scanned EOBs, you know, anything that's got a patient name, date of birth, a phone number, an address, chart ID, that's all considered HIPAA protected health information and has to be, you have to monitor who tracks it, who logged into it. You need to back it up, you need to encrypt it, so you don't really eliminate the need for a server or IT just because you have a cloud-based PMS program. But as I said, you do get HIPAA compliance with them as well. On the downside, they all have monthly subscription costs, depending on the type of software you're talking about. Anywhere from $200 to $1,000 a month is pretty standard, depending on the add-on. So it can get pretty costly. Of course, if your internet goes down, you go down, so that doesn't help you much. You don't really have much control over the software and the development of it. You're kind of locked into that specific vendor. And as I say, HIPAA is a pro, but it's also a con because you don't really know. They can tell you, yes, this is what we're doing for HIPAA compliance, but how do you know? Unless you drive over to their data, where their database is stored, and actually look at their server, you don't really know that they're doing what they say they're doing. All kinds of options out there. There's Curve Dental, Dentrix has one called Ascend, Open Dental, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. They now have a cloud-based version as well. Aptrix for images, they have a web-based version. Actually, that's the only one that they're currently selling is the web-based version. You can do, QuickBooks. You can get that online. You can actually do it like a private cloud. This is what we do. We didn't want to do QuickBooks online. It was going to cost me about $200 a month for the number of users that we have. I just hired a company that has a cloud server that's secure and HIPAA compliant, and I just basically remote into that server to access my QuickBooks, and it cost me about 10% of what the QuickBooks Online would have cost me. So there's all kinds of solutions out there. You can even do a complete computer online, Windows 365. This was announced a few months ago. You're looking at about, I don't know, it depends on the version that you get, about $65 to $75 a month that you could have a full Windows PC in the cloud. You could access from a Mac or an iPad or whatever you want. Still not a great solution if you have any type of USB device. So for example, it wouldn't really work if you have digital X-ray sensors, because how are you going to run it off that remote cloud Windows setup? Remote control is a little bit different, where you're actually logged into another computer from, say, your home. It's basically you're logging on to that computer as if you were sitting directly in front of it. So it's a little bit different than a cloud solution. The advantage is that there's a lot of systems out there that are either free or certainly very low cost. They are somewhat easy to set up. You can, if you have internet access, you can access any computer anywhere in the world. Doesn't really make a difference. They are relatively easy to learn for the most part. However, it does require a little bit of skill to set up, especially if you have to port forward on your router, which you don't want to do. Some of them require that you open up a port on your firewall. That is a big security risk if you're going to open up a hole in your firewall. That kind of defeats the whole purpose of that firewall. So you need to be cautious of those. Many of them don't have auditing and logging, which is required by HIPAA. HIPAA says that you need to track who accessed patient information and when and what do they do with it. So you need to be able to track all that stuff. Some of them don't have an auto shut off. So in other words, if you walk away from your computer and you've been away for 10, 15 minutes, will it close the connection on its own, or do you have to do that manually? And the other big downside, of course, is that if you're accessing a computer from another location, that computer can't be used by whoever would normally be sitting in front of it. So either you have to buy another computer that is just used for that remote access, or you're logging into a computer that nobody uses, because you can't have two people working on the same. It'd be as if, because it's like sitting right in front of there, it would be as if you had two people sitting at a computer. You're gonna be fighting for the mouse and the keyboard. So that's a downside. Microsoft has a built-in remote desktop services. We don't recommend that. It's not really HIPAA compliant. Same for VNC, which we've used for years, but it's really not HIPAA compliant. TeamViewer is HIPAA compliant. We do have a number of offices using this. Splashtop is also HIPAA compliant. So there's a lot of decent systems out there. And as I talked about earlier, there's ones that we use in IT. Kaseya is the one that a lot of IT providers use. We use one called Terra, which I like a lot better than Kaseya. There's all kinds of options, but you need to have that conversation with your IT company. Hey guys, how are you securing your portal that you use to access remotely? And if they're not using 2FA, they really should be. The final one is what's called a virtual private network, or VPN. The best way I can describe, let me see if I have another picture of it. It's basically you're extending a private network through the internet. I think this screen here probably gives you the best look at. Imagine, so inside your office, you've got a bunch of computers. They're all connected with network cables or through Wi-Fi. Imagine if you could then take an imaginary cable, an invisible cable, and stretch it all the way from your office to your home, and then you have a computer connected there. That's what a VPN is that you're using the internet as if it was a secure network cable, which is obviously very secure. The advantage of that is that they're incredibly secure. They're encrypted, very low setup and maintenance costs once you get them in place, obviously. Relatively easy to transfer files, because it's no different as if you have a computer inside your office network that you're using to transfer files from. Anyone that's ever set this up, we know these are very challenging to set up. I do not recommend this if you don't have IT background in doing something like that. The encryption will lower your bandwidth by about 40%. So however slow it is already to do remote access, you're basically removing half of the speed when you have a VPN in place. They are a bear to maintain. Ask anyone in IT, and we'll tell you that, and they're just not reliable as much as we'd like them to be. You typically want to use like a VPN router to connect, and it has to be on both ends, on both. Yes, if you're doing it from your home to the office, you need it at the office and at home as well. There are software ones like Hamachi. This is through LogMeIn. So again, lots of options. I don't want to have people confused, because there are other types of VPNs. Many of you may be familiar with the VPN concept. Let's say you were traveling to Europe. You wanted to be able to access your Netflix account and be able to, show American shows. Actually, Netflix is kind of a bad example. They got around this, but the way that a VPN works in that case is that you log into a server which is based somewhere else, and then all requests from to the website come from that server, not from you. So it kind of hides your IP address. They're not as secure as they're made out to be, but this is not what I was talking about. This is not, allowing you to, be able to play Netflix from a remote location. A business VPN is a way of being able to access your data from another location. How do you deal with the malware that gets into your network? You need to obviously make sure that you've got up-to-date antivirus software in place. There's a lot of good ones out there. The free ones we tend to stay away from, like Avira. The one that we're currently recommending for our clients is called MSISoft. We did ESET for years. Norton's, we never really recommended. It's a real resource hog on the network. I always recommend, even though the antivirus programs tell you we do a good job against ransomware, that hasn't been my experience. And I would always recommend supplementing your general purpose antivirus with anti-ransomware software. The two best known ones out there are Intercept X and Hitman Pro. They're kind of interchangeable because they're owned by the same company, by Sophos, who owns the firewalls that we typically use. So they kind of do the same thing. That being the case, and we talked about this, nothing you do is foolproof. A lot of the viruses out there are what's called 0-day. And that's basically meaning that they're so new, your firewall, your antivirus software doesn't know that it's a virus. So what do you do in that particular case? What we've been recommending for all of our clients, we've got about 350 active clients, but we only have about 30 or 40 right now that are on this. And we're trying to get them to sort of come around to our way of thinking. It's not terribly expensive in my mind, is application whitelisting. What is that? It's the practice of specifying an index of approved software that you're allowing to run. Let me give you, I think this is the best analogy I can come up with. Let's say that you heard about this really swanky private party that was occurring in town. You weren't invited, but you figure you're going to crash the party. You really want to get into that party. So you show up there. There is a very large bouncer at the door with a very short list of names on it. Basic rule of thumb is if your name isn't on that list, you ain't getting in. That's basically what application whitelisting is. if you are not an approved software program, you literally cannot run. Ring fencing is slightly different, where we basically build fences around applications. So if you're an Open Dental user, for example, or Dentrix, that's already kind of in place. They have policies to say, hey, we're going to allow these third-party programs. We're going to allow Demandforce or Yappy or whatever to connect to our database, and other ones can't. That's what ring fencing is. So I think this infographic kind of explains the way that the process works, is that we scan the network. We usually let the software run for, say, a week or two. We have, as I said, about 350 offices that we're currently supporting. We developed this big global database of all those clients, or the 30 or so that have the application whitelisting with us. We put all that together so that we have one big database. At a certain point, we flip the switch, say a week or two later, and at that point, if any program tries to run, you're going to see an error message that's going to prevent it from running. All viruses, all ransomware are programs. They're just a set of instructions that tells it what to do. Get onto the system, hide yourself, disable the antivirus software, lock the files, leave the ransom note, get off. I mean, it's not a whole lot more complicated than that. So this to me is it's unbelievable. For the 8 or 9 months that we've been doing this for those clients, we have yet to see a single virus infection on any of them. And I would not have been able to say that before we started doing this. So it really is a game changer. What would happen is that if you try to run a program that hasn't been approved, and a lot of times we still see this all the time, because you might get an update to Open Dental or Dentrix that, because it's a brand new update, the software doesn't recognize it yet. So we have to approve it. The entire process of, you request it, it sends an email to us. That entire process takes about 90 to 100 seconds, give or take, for us to get it, to approve it, or the system to accept that. And that's only for the first person that has to apply that update. The next person won't deal with that because it's already been added to our global database. You do need to lock everything down with encryption. I highly recommend this. Now, one of the things that we hear from some people is to say, well, I don't think I have to do encryption because it's not a required HIPAA law. It's only an addressable law. Well, let's talk about that for a second. What does addressable mean? And some of the emphasis here is mine, the bold letters. A covered entity, which is you, a lab, a dentist, must, not maybe, must implement an addressable implementation if it's reasonable and appropriate. And if it's not reasonable and appropriate, come up with some type of alternative, or just basically document why you think there is no reasonable and appropriate alternative. This is not a get out of jail free card. We talked about encryption is the get out of jail free card, but this is addressable does not mean, hey, you don't feel like doing it, that's okay, just either come up with some alternative or put it in writing why you think it's not appropriate. And that whole term of reasonable appropriate comes into play. And I'll give you an example when it comes to encryption. You have an encryption software built into your computers. If you have Windows Server 2012 or 16 or 19 or 22, if you have Windows 10 or Windows 11, you have a built-in encryption program called BitLocker. It's part of the software, it's free. Now, you're probably going to want to pay an IT company to help you get it set up properly and make sure you do that the way it's supposed to be done. So you pay a little bit for labor, but it's not like you have to go out and spend thousands of dollars on the software. It's already there. So imagine having that argument with the auditor, and you saying to them, well, we did not think encryption was reasonable and appropriate. And they're going to come back and say, well, why? It's built into your software. It's free. So, and plus, as I mentioned, because of the fact that encryption is a get out of jail free card, to me, that in and of itself would be a reason to encrypt it. You should absolutely encrypt your servers. You don't have to encrypt all your workstations unless you keep any protected health information on there. Most of the practices that we work with have patient information on their workstations, not necessarily intentionally, but the office manager might have some scanned EOBs on there, and the dentist might have some photos on there, or whatever, or downloaded documents. And that, by in and of itself, I said, by HIPAA laws, means you really need to encrypt that. You really need to make sure it is backed up. So ideally, put all your data on the server, but if not, make sure you're protecting it on the other computers as well. If you are using an older system, Windows 7 or Server 2008, there are still free programs out there, TrueCrypt, VeraCrypt. I mean, there's no excuse not to be encrypting your data, in my opinion. How about backup? As I said, we could spend literally a whole hour talking about it. We're going to take more like 2 minutes to talk about it. There are many different ways to back up. Tape was really popular back in the 80s and 90s. Hopefully none of you are still using tape. We also tried rewritable DVDs and CD-ROMs, and again, they have limited storage. We still have some offices that like to use portable external hard drives. They come in all shapes and sizes, basically unlimited, really cheap storage. But the way that we've approached backup with our clients is that we really try to eliminate the human component. You guys have better things to deal with than doing your backup. So that's where we are happy to take over. There's all kinds of backup software program. This is a free one called Karen's Replicator. There's paid ones like SyncBack Pro. I am a big fan of cloud/online data storage. Why? It gets it off-site. That is a HIPAA law. HIPAA says that your backup has to be retrievable. And what that basically means is that if the office burns down, can you retrieve it? So it's got to be off-site. It is secure and it is an automated process. Things to look for in your backup system: make sure it's HIPAA compliant, that there's encryption keys, that it is encrypted. Make sure you're working with a company that has more than one server. If that server dies, then what good is your backup? You want to have backups of the backup of the backup in servers all over the country. Needs to be able to copy open databases, multiple versions of your data, be able to restore single files, and as I said, we like it to be automated. The one that we use for our clients, the one that we help develop, it's called Data Protect. There's other ones out there. It's important to understand when we're talking about backup, most of you hopefully have a server that has mirrored hard drives. We call that RAID. There's different levels of RAID. That is not a backup. That is redundancy. That is not going to help you if the office burns down or someone walks in and walks off with the server. It's got to be offsite, either an external hard drive or online. We actually have some people doing both now. The concern with ransomware is that, we've never seen a situation where an online backup has gotten compromised, because the way that we do our backup is that it does the local first, and if that doesn't work, or if there's some corruption there, then the online won't run either. So we haven't seen an online one yet, but we still have people that are nervous, and we say, okay, well, you can do an external hard drive. You can't, a ransomware cannot hit a hard drive if it's not connected to your system. It's called air gap. There's literally air between that backup and your server. So we do have some offices that although they have a local backup and an online backup, they're also doing like a hard drive that they take home, and we're fine with that as long as it's encrypted. That we'll be happy to set it up. The local backup is basically an emergency server. It's going to be not just the data. We call it an image. It's a copy of everything. The entire server operating system, the program files, the data. We virtualize it. So let's say your server's down for whatever reason, we fire up that virtual copy of the server. As soon as that happens, as far as the rest of the computers in the network are concerned, the server's up and running. You can go ahead and pull up your practice management data, your lab data, you can pull up your images, you're free to work normally at that point. So we really recommend a combination of local and off-site. Definitely recommend that you have some type of insurance in place. As I said, when we do it for our clients, $250,000 minimum. You never know. By the time you get hit with fines and penalties, if you suffered a breach and have to write a letter to all those patients, you're going to lose patients no matter what. You're potentially looking at lawsuits. It's nasty business. It's considered standard of care to provide some type of credit monitoring for those patients for at least a year or two. So it gets pricey. You're really going to want to have some type of cyber liability insurance or breach insurance. The final part of that 6-point plan is, how do you do a risk assessment? One of the challenges with doing a risk assessment, they call it a risk analysis, is, I think it's in the middle of the screen here, where it's under section A there. That is it. I mean, that's all that's written about how to do a risk assessment. It's literally one sentence. There is no how to do it. That being the case, there is a document out there by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It's document 800-30, and it is 95 pages. If you suffer from insomnia, it is a great cure because it is boring as you can possibly imagine, but it's thorough, and it says what most of you can probably already figure out on your own. You have to be thorough. It's not enough to just do an online questionnaire for 10 minutes. That would be like treating the patient based on them just filling out their medical history form. You got to look at it from an administrative standpoint, policies and procedures, incident response forms. Physically, do you have locks on the doors? What do you do with the charts at night? Do you have an alarm system? And of course, the bulk of it is IT, looking at everything from encryption to user accounts to auditing and logging. That's why I said this process normally takes about 5 to 8 hours when we do it for our clients. If it's done properly, it should give you some type of risk score. I don't know how they figure out the algorithms for doing this, but this is the one that we use for our clients, and it gives us a list of everything, point by point. What were the things that were found? This is, the actual summary of what we found, but the thing that gets generated from that, which is the most critical part, is then their version of the treatment plan called a management plan. This is the thing that the HIPAA auditors will look at if you are ever audited. They want to see, have you done it, and have you at least started to lift a finger? They don't expect that you're going to get to everything on that list on day one. What they do want to see is that you've at least made a good faith effort to start that process. So let's summarize what we talked about. I'm going to make a few special offers, and then, as I said, we're going to open it up to Q&A. For some of you who may not have been here at the very beginning, this webinar is recorded, so I will usually send that out. I'll try to get it out this evening. I may not get to it till tomorrow morning, but it will certainly within the next 24 hours will go out. Same thing for the CE credits. If you've made it this far, you're getting CE credits. That will be emailed to you as long as you were on for the bulk of it. If you showed up for the last 10 minutes of the webinar, unfortunately, I can't do that. California has certain requirements that we have to meet when it comes to giving out CE, and I don't want to risk losing my license. So what are the steps that I think you should take right now? First and foremost, start off with that risk assessment. You don't know what you don't know, so you've got to look. Do that annual risk assessment, develop a HIPAA management plan in place. And again, if it's done properly by someone who knows what they're doing, these will be generated concurrently. You should have a policies and procedure manual. I would caution you, any of you that have ever purchased the ADA manual, it's actually just a template. If you bought that thing and stuck it on a shelf and never opened it, you really should, because there's a lot of blank lines in there. When we do it for our clients, it's just a customized manual. We've never seen anyone that's been audited that's been dinged for having an improper manual. They just want to see that you've got it. But if they look at the ADA and see all that blank space, that's a potential problem. So, ideally have someone that's print one up for you. Minimum of $250,000 of cyber liability insurance. You really should encrypt any what's called EPHI, electronic protected health information. That's anything that's identifiable. So anything that's got a patient name, a photo, date of birth, phone number, chart ID, that's all identifiers and has to be encrypted. If you're going to be emailing other offices, which I'm sure most of you do, if you're emailing patients, you really should use an encrypted email system. The good news is that most of the better systems out there work with your existing email address. You don't have to get a whole new email address or use a whole new system. Google has systems. If you're already a Gmail user, you can just move up to their paid version. I can't remember what's even called. It used to be G Suite. Now it's Google for Business or Google for Workspace or something like that. Or there's ones that we recommend like Secure Mail and AppRiver. They're all good and they all cost about the same, around $8 to $10 per user per month. So it's certainly not horribly expensive. You really should have, a good, decent backup and disaster recovery system in place. One of the HIPAA laws is that you have to test and verify that. As I mentioned, the best way to do that is to just shut off your server and see how long it takes to get back up and running. The software telling you the backup was successful, in my mind, is not enough. You have to go beyond that. Again, another HIPAA law, you have to be patching your systems on a regular basis. The network monitoring, you don't have to do that by HIPAA law. The software that we use does both. So why not take advantage of monitoring the network while it's also patching your systems? You should have some general purpose antivirus software in place. It should be paid. The basic rule of thumb is if it's free, it's not particularly great. Spend the $30 a month or $30 computer per year that it would typically cost you to have some decent antivirus software. But supplement that with some type of ransomware protection, anti-ransomware specific software. And if you're only going to do one thing, I mean, I think everyone should have firewalls, they should have antivirus and anti-ransomware, but if you're only going to do one thing, it would be the application whitelisting, because that will stop any non-approved programs. For most of our clients, they're spending less than $100 a month to have this software. I really think compared to the downside of not having it and suffering, days and days of downtime and fines and penalties and breaches, $99 a month isn't really a major investment. But it's not my money. Who am I to say? But this is what we would certainly recommend for any office, no matter how small they are. You should have a business associate agreement signed with anyone that has access to your data other than referring offices or labs. You have to do staff training on a regular basis as well. I will send out a link to this when I send out the follow-up, is that there's a number of good online courses out there where you and your staff can do the training. Most of them take less than an hour. You can stop and start in the middle as much as you want. You take a quiz at the end. I don't know anyone that's ever failed the quiz. You then get a certificate that says you were trained. Stick it in your manual. Don't worry about it again for another year or so. Any website that offers two-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication, that's where that secondary code gets sent to your email or to your phone, should be in place. And definitely, as I mentioned a couple of times now, talk with your IT provider. Make sure that whatever system they use to access you remotely has this in place, or they have some other system, like you can do it that it limits it just by IP addresses. And there's ways that you can secure those portals, but they have to be secure. You don't want something that anyone can break into. So I'm going to make a few offers that I'm hoping that you will take advantage of. The first, as I mentioned, you don't know what you don't know. This is not a full risk assessment, but one thing that we have been offering for years for people, potential new clients, we call it a tech audit or security audit. The whole process takes about 20 to 30 minutes. We log onto your systems, we run some software tests, we ask you a few questions, stuff that we can't see by when we look at the network. Things like, what are you doing for backup, and how do you email other offices, and when's the last time, if ever, that you've done a risk assessment. So we typically charge a little under $100 for that. I'm waiving that fee up through the end of this month, $0. As I said, it only takes about 20 to 30 minutes. There's certainly no obligation. When we are done, I will then, my office manager would set up a call with you to go over the findings. I would give you my recommendations, different types of plans that we have, different packages, and then it's up to you to decide if and how you want to proceed. The way that you can sign up for that free audit is to go to my website, which is thedigitaldentist.com. I'm also going to offer free IT consulting. Again, we typically charge for this, but if you contact, and it doesn't have to be completed by the end of the month. You just have to contact me and say, hey, Lauren, I want your help. I want to pick your brain. I think I want to do the audit. I'm not sure. I've got some questions. I didn't want to ask them on the webinar. I was a little shy. Great. So give me a call. I'm not going to charge for that time. And again, you just go to my main website, which is thedigitaldentist.com. This is what it looks like when you get to that website. It's just a picture of me and a couple of boxes there. You put in your name and practice name, your email address, your phone number. It will send an email to my office manager, Candace, and then she will follow up with you to either schedule a phone call with me or to schedule that security audit. Let's say you're still not quite ready for that you want to see where you're at, but you don't want someone hopping onto your network quite yet. You don't really want to talk to me yet. You're not 100% sure. Great, we got something for you as well. if you go to a website, it's called go.thedigital.dentist.com. And again, I'm going to send out a follow-up with all these links. But if you go to go.thedigital.dentist.com, I actually created a 7-point security checklist. It takes literally 2 minutes to go through that, and you can just answer yes or no. And just to give you a real basic idea, do you have the things that we would consider to be the low-hanging fruit, the absolute basic security in place to protect yourself? So you can go to that website as well. I mentioned the need to have a business associate agreement. I'm going to send you one. I'll send you the template that we use. I'm not going to charge you for it. It's perfectly free. If any of you are using, if you already have BAAs with other companies, but they were signed before 2013, then those ones are no longer valid. When HIPAA came out with the final omnibus rules, they changed some of the requirements for a BAA. The one that we did has obviously been created since 2013. But I'm going to send that to everybody for free when I send you the follow-ups as well. There are numerous ways to get a hold of me. As I said, you can go to my website, thedigital.dentist.com. If you want to email me directly, it's drlevine@thedigital.dentist.com. We have a toll-free number, 866-204-3398, extension 200. That will get you through to Candace, my office manager, and she'll be happy to schedule a call or send you more information or whatever your needs are. She'll be happy to help you with that. So I'm going to open it up to questions at this point. I don't even know how many we have. I'll leave the offers up there as well as a reminder. It's a free security audit, free IT consulting. I'm going to send you the business associate agreement as well, and there's plenty of ways to get a hold of me, but I think the website's usually the easiest. So great, we do have a number of questions. Let's get through it. Okay, so first question is, do you recommend online backup? Well, I guess this was asked before we got into that. So yes, I do. And what company? We do it ourselves. We use a hybrid mix of different software, different backup companies for secure servers. We never really felt comfortable using some of the ones that most of you may have heard of, the companies like Mozy or Carbonite. A lot of times they don't do a local backup, or if you need to get data sent to you, they don't offer a way for you to download it. You have to overnight it to them. They don't really have HIPAA compliance in place. So we want to have complete control over everything, the software we use, the servers we use. Some of the servers we use are with a national company. Some we actually have our own server in a data center here in LA, and it's backed up to other servers as well. So we have complete control over it. It's not something you can just go out and buy it, Best Buy or whatever. This is something that we do on our own. Okay. If the IT company is the source of the breach, would they be responsible for any monetary loss due to the ransomware? Nope, that's the big challenge. They have a responsibility, which is to report to you that there was a breach of that data. You are the covered entity, and the buck stops with you. And I know it may sound like it's completely unfair, but that's the reality, is that it's your data. It belongs to your patient, and you have to take appropriate steps to secure it. I guess maybe there are some circumstances where they'd be partially responsible, but that's the whole point of having the BAA, is that if they don't do what they're supposed to do, that's a contract. You could always sue them for damages because they didn't do the things that they're supposed to do. But at the end of the day, it is your data. Would you consider AppLocker a sufficient whitelist application? I'm actually not all that familiar with AppLocker, so I don't want to comment on it. As I said, the one that we use, we call it Threat Block. There's other ones out there that kind of do the same thing, but do some research. As I say, when I send you the follow-up with all the information that about the webinar and the offers, I'll include a link for a whole article that I wrote on application whitelisting and why it's important. Does encryption slow down the speed of the programs, loading time and radiograph capturing? Yes, but it is so insignificant that it really doesn't matter. We see that we got that a lot when people were first starting to encrypt their databases, and they would talk to their Dentrix or Eaglesoft and they would tell them, oh, no, you don't want to do that. It's really going to slow things down. As a real world example, let's say normally without encryption takes you 1.2 seconds to open up a chart. If you have it encrypted, then it takes 1.3 seconds. I mean, like I said, it is negligible. You would not really be able to tell there's a difference. In theory, yes, it's slowing it down slightly, not enough, in my opinion, to ever be able to justify not encrypting it. The downside of having a slight, millisecond delay is nothing compared to days of downtime and tens of thousands, if not more, in fines and penalties. Where do we reach to do the full risk assessment? This is a service that we offer. One thing that's kind of surprising to me, because I've been in the IT field since '98, and while I was in practice, and then full time since 2002, there are not a lot of dental IT companies doing risk assessments. I don't understand why that's the case, because as I mentioned, it's very heavily weighted on the IT portion of the scale. I mean, to do a risk assessment, you have to look at things like how the network was set up, and network shares, and encryption, and user accounts, and password policies. The list goes on and on. So I don't know why more dental IT companies aren't doing it. They should. I highly think that they should. Of course, we're happy to not have the competition. We're happy to do it. But as I said, and I have friends who have OSHA/HIPAA companies. It's not meant as a dig against them. But if you're going to talk to a company that has always been an OSHA company and they just tacked on HIPAA, really find out what is actually entailed with that HIPAA audit. Because if they're not logging onto your network and getting all the data that I just mentioned, it's not a proper risk assessment. You have to look at all those things. So you really need to be a little careful about that. Is there a good approach to grow your cybersecurity with your practice when you're just starting out? You need to start with everything in place. That's kind of a hard question to answer. The challenge with HIPAA, everything that I discussed tonight, with the exception of the insurance, everything that we talked about has an associated HIPAA law. By law, you have to have a backup. It has to be offsite. You have to be encrypted. You have to encrypt your communications. You have to patch everything. You have to protect yourself against viruses. So the vast majority of our clients will get some type of package. We have different types of packages where they might just get like a basic package, and then they have another package that includes all the services and unlimited IT support. There's a third package where we include, replacing their computers every 3 years. It's really up to you individually. Obviously, as a startup, you have a more limited budget. As much as you would love to be able to get everything, sometimes it's just not realistic. When we work with new offices, when we work with people with a limited budget, the approach that I take is, okay, if you have a limited budget, here are the 3 or 4 things that I think are the most critical. And I can tell you off the top of my head, it'll probably be the things that we have in our basic package, which is you have to do the risk assessment and obviously resolve those issues. You have to have a backup in place. You really should be encrypted, and you should have application whitelisting. If there were 3 or 4 things that I think are critical that you should have in place, those would be it. That's going to be about half the cost of what it would cost to do a full package of services. We still have the occasional office that wants to do just an individual service. They just do backup with us. They just have a firewall with us. We're happy to do that. But again, as I said, the challenge is that you're not really protecting yourself. This is one of those circumstances where it's not enough to just, you want to wear a belt and suspenders at the same time. You want to have multiple levels of protection because you just don't know. Nothing is 100% foolproof. Is having an IT provider enough with all the recommendations that you provided? I think so. I mean, but with a caveat, it really should be an IT provider that is fluent in dental or fluent in healthcare. They have to know about HIPAA. They have to know about cybersecurity. It always helps to have a dental IT provider who knows Open Dental and Dentrix and Aptrix and XDR and can do a lot of the troubleshooting for you and has access to those companies. I mean, that's kind of, that's the value add that we bring to the table when we work with a dental office is, hey, not only was I a practicing dentist for 10 years, but my techs have been exclusive to dental offices for 20 years. I've got 2 guys that have been with me for 20 years and all they've done are dental. So I think it certainly helps. Now, of course, that may sound a little self-serving, but the fact is that, listen, there's a reason why, a lot of general dentists don't place their own implants, or they don't do their own ortho or third molar extractions, or, molar endo, and it's because they just don't have the comfort level. It's not something they do every day. Same thing with this, is that, and as I mentioned at the beginning, we do have the occasional office that says, listen, I have an IT guy that I love. He comes in whenever we call him. He's not long distance. I want to be able to keep him, but I know he's not doing this stuff for us. I know he's not keeping us secure, and he doesn't know a lot about this HIPAA stuff. How do we all get to work together? And my answer is, I learned a long time ago how to play nicely with others. We will fill in those gaps. We will make sure that your local IT is up to speed on what we're doing. Whatever they're not doing, we can help. We can do that, and you still call them up for your day-to-day stuff. But if there's a problem with one of the things that we're handling, if we're handling the backup or the firewall for you or the ransomware, then we're the ones that will take over or work with them as you see fit. So I do recommend, yes, I think having an IT provider is enough, as long as they are, up to date on all the stuff that we've been talking about. How much is the online backup? It depends on how much data you have. Most of our clients have around 100 to 200 gigabytes of data. We have some that are quite a bit more than that, some that are a little bit less. The typical practice is about 125 to 150 a month. Yes, there are cheaper options out there, but as I said, you're getting full service backup from us when we do that. You're getting the backup. You're getting us monitoring that backup each and every single day. If you ever have to restore the backup, if your server goes down and we need to do a full restore, that's included in that. So, it's basically you pay the monthly fee. You never have to pay for IT support related to the backup or any issues related to the backup. Beyond that, that's all included in the monthly. The big ones that I talked about, the Moseys, the Carbonites, the Amazons, yeah, you can probably find a system for 20, 30 bucks a month. I mean, there's certainly a lot cheaper options out there, but they're not going to be managed. They're not going to be able to help you if something goes wrong. They're not going to, they might give you some basic troubleshooting, but they're not going to know how to fix it. So we would typically recommend splurge a little bit. I think of all the services we've been talking about. I think backup is really, really critical. So it's not something that I would tend to try to go cheap on if you can. Are password protected programs considered encrypted? Dentrix is password protected. Server Windows needs login and password before the login. Unfortunately, no. I think you absolutely should have passwords. That's a no-brainer. You should always have passwords. Although, we're trying to get away from that. I think, we're seeing more and more people using things like thumbprint readers and iris scans. I mean, I think, at some point, 10, 15, 20 years down the road, we're going to be away from passwords, and we'll be looking at more biometric things like the things that I mentioned. But it's not enough to say that you have a password in place. Even though it's a great first step, it's not the same as encryption. There's certain terms that they don't actually use the word encryption in the HIPAA requirements. It's like unreadable, indecipherable. I can't remember what the third one is, but as much as I think you should have the password policies in place, it's not the same as having encryption. What do you need to do for security for an old server? There's air gap in terms of backup encryption. The data never changes. It's just for old patients we've not seen for a while. Potentially not much. By the letter of the law, are you supposed to have a current system in place? Yes, absolutely. Are you supposed to have the latest operating system and patches? Yeah. If the old server is just sitting there and it's air gap, meaning that there's no connection to any other computer on the network, and you just physically will pull up records as from time to time, is it by the letter of the law? Is it ideal? No. Is it, if that's the worst thing that you have, if you ever get audited, I think you're in good shape. And truthfully, if you ever get audited, if you get notice of an audit, you typically have 10 days before they're going to show up. I would just honestly, take the server out of there and just take it home. You don't want to run the risk of it, but the one thing that the criteria is there, it has to be air gap. If you have an insecure device, a workstation server, and it is connected to the rest of the network, by definition, the entire network is at risk, because that computer can be the access point for a virus, and viruses easily propagate over your network. Very easy for them to spread across the network to the server. That's how, I mean, that's most ransomware, that's how it happens, is that they enter through a workstation, typically through email, but it hits the server database. So those viruses know exactly how to get from point A to point B. Let's see this. How does someone claim that their data was released by a dental office? And if the data was released, can they sue for it? It's possible. I mean, if as I said, in that situation, there actually was a case a number of years ago in Pennsylvania where a dental office, was a Dentrix office, their database had been compromised and it was posted online. And I'm sure they were sued, and I'm sure they had all kinds of issues with that. If a database is compromised, or if it's stolen, if someone actually copies the database and puts it online, it's usually not that hard to figure out how they got it. So, you know, that's typically something that is easy to figure out. Is Windows Remote Desktop Connection safe to use? No. As I mentioned when we were talking about the remote access programs, there's certain things you want to look for. Some of the key things are auditing and logging, that you can track who accessed things remotely and when and how did they do it. And you know, you need to also have what's called an auto shut off. Let's say you're logged in remotely to your office computer, you walk away from the computer, and you know, an hour later it's still open. I mean, your spouse, your kids, anyone can walk over to the computer and see what's on there. That's not safe as well. Windows Remote Desktop does not have that. A lot of IT companies will use it because it is somewhat easy to set up. We don't recommend it. The other big reason why I would not recommend Windows Remote Desktop is that you have to open up a port on the router. It's typically port 3389 on your firewall, your router. That's the only way that works. So you would never want to open up a port on the router if there's any way around that. Okay, if we enlist your services, would you physically come on site to evaluate the IT system? I would love to. I am more than happy to travel. Typically for something like that, I've got to charge, obviously, especially if you're not in the Southern California area. I'm not getting on a plane, I charge for that. If you are doing the technical audit, the security audit, there's not really a need to do that, because all we really need to do is to hop onto your server and a couple of workstations. You can watch what we're doing if you're not sure that we're on the up and up. We'll sign the BAA, obviously, if you're worried about us looking at your data. But then we ask you or your office manager just some basic questions. That's really the criteria that we need. Normally, if I'm going on site for an office, it would be to do a more formal, like a risk assessment. If it's an office that wants all new hardware, or if it's a new office or an office that's planning to add operatories and they want help on monitor locations and cabling and just stuff that it's way easier to accomplish that remote on site versus remote, then I will obviously do that. I'm happy to have that conversation with you, Greg. But in most cases, I mean, with COVID, I'd say before COVID, when we did installations where we actually set up networks and computers and servers and monitors and all that stuff, before COVID, I would say probably 80–90% of our installations were on site, 10–20% were remote. When COVID hit, it was 100% remote. And we were actually quite surprised about how many people were comfortable doing that. Because we send the computers and the server to us first. We do all the initial configuration. We ship it to you, and all you really have to do is take the computers out of the box and plug them in. If for some reason you're not comfortable doing that, we have a network of about 2,500 IT providers, none that are probably more than a couple hours drive from anyone in the US, that we can get them to drive out there, and they'll take the stuff out of the boxes for you and set it up, and we do all the rest remotely. So even to this day, even though COVID is sort of on the downslide now, I'd say probably 60–70% of our installs are remote, and we're still only doing about 30–40% that are on site. We charge more for on site. We have to pay for travel costs as well, which you have to pay. So a lot of people are saying, hey, I'm okay taking it out of the box, and I'm happy to save myself a couple $1,000s on installation fees and travel costs. So in those cases, remote may make more sense. We're flexible. We work 7 days a week. We're more than happy to find a solution that works for an office. So we are done with the questions now. We're almost at the bottom of the hour, and I really wanted to be done by 1:30 as well. I want to thank all of you for joining me this evening. As I mentioned at the beginning, I had two main goals. Number one, I hope that you learned something new that you didn't know beforehand. That's my number one goal. And number two, I hope that you got your questions answered. If you have more questions, you are more than welcome to reach out to me through the website at thedigitalDentist.com, at my email, which is drlevine@thedigitalDentist.com. I'm on all the social media places as well. I'm Dentaltown. I'm well known there. Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. You can find me on all of those as well. As a reminder, I'll say this for the third time. I did record the webinar. That recording should go out sometime in the next 12 to 18 hours. I will send out the CE for all of you that stayed on for the bulk of the webinar. I will send out a follow-up, just reviewing the offers that we have. It will have the business associate agreement with that, some of the links that we talked about as well. And I would encourage you that if you have questions, if you're really not sure where you're at or where you need to be, just call me up or email me or fill out the form on the website. I'm happy to have the conversation and try to get you to a better place. As I said, a lot of people just don't know where they need to be, and hopefully I've given some of you some guidance about how to get there. So thank you all for your attention, for joining, for the great questions. And we do these webinars on a regular basis. I do them myself. Many of you know that I host webinars for DenMat and Golden Dental Solutions. And if you were invited to this webinar, you'll be invited to those as well. You're more than welcome to join those. They're all free. They're all CE provided webinars, some great content out there. Please stay safe and healthy out there, and we look forward to seeing you all on future webinars. Good night, everyone.